Southeast Peninsula, Florida. Across South Florida, we remain under a surface ridge anchored offshore with easterly to east northeasterly low level flow and mid level zonal winds. Over the Gulf, a weak mid level low is retrograding, while the southern stream imparts high level cloudiness. But low and mid levels are comparatively dry. In the region around Miami, Florida, the dominant feature is the maritime easterly flow under the ridge, promoting generally dry conditions and minimal precipitation risk. Forecast high temperatures reach the low to mid 80s Fahrenheit, and lows tonight drop into the 60s inland and low 70s near the coast. On the marine side, onshore winds maintain elevated seas and a high rip current risk, especially along the Atlantic coast associated with king tides and the tight pressure gradient. For aviation, VFR is expected, with easterly winds prevailing and no significant convective threat. Meanwhile, around Tampa, Florida, a similar zonal upper flow pattern is in place, with warm-up underway as the offshore ridge builds. Surface high pressure just east of the Atlantic allows a quick warm-up into the lower mid-80s today. Moisture will gradually return through the weekend, but today remains dry and VFR. Marine hazards will build behind the next frontal boundary early next week. Mechanisms and aviation relevance. The persistence of the surface ridge placed east of the peninsula suppresses large-scale ascent and limits moisture advection into the peninsula. The weak cutoff low over the Gulf remains disconnected from strong forcing, thus little precipitation. For flight operations, this means steady conditions, light easterlies, and minimal weather hazards inland. But coastal operations must monitor elevated seas, surf, and potential sea fog or low-level wind shear in marine terminals. Southeast U.S. and Mid-Atlantic, Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee corridor. Shifting northward, the pattern shows a broad zonal to weak troughing regime across the southeastern U.S., with a surface ridge gradually exiting offshore and a trough approaching from the north. For terminals such as Atlanta, Georgia, and Knoxville, Tennessee, the upper flow remains relatively flat, limiting dynamic lift. Low-level moisture is modest and surface winds remain moderate. Thus, for today, mostly stable conditions with VFR expected and minimal precipitation chances. However, winds will slowly shift from northeast to south or southwest, ahead of the next frontal boundary later in the weekend. Aviation concerns focus on the potential for increased haze or low-level moisture buildup overnight, especially in valleys. But for now, good flying conditions prevail. Gulf Coast and Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. From the Gulf Coast into Alabama and Mississippi, the weak cutoff low in the central Gulf persists, introducing a slight elevation in unsettled potential. For marine and coastal areas such as around Mobile, Alabama, and Jacksonville, Mississippi, near zonal flow aloft and the surface ridge eastward. Again, limit strong convective forcing, but the proximity of the cutoff low means a slightly elevated wind and seas regime. For aviation across this sector, expect VFR with more attention required for coastal marine zones, where gustie onshore winds or sea breeze circulations may create low-level shear or turbulence. The broader mechanism, weak upper troughing, plus residual Gulf moisture, but inhibited by ridge dominance and dry mid-levels. Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. In the northern third of the country, The pattern is beginning to show a large-scale trough digging into the eastern U.S. with the jet stream dipping and surface cold air advection underway. For airports such as Boston, Massachusetts, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Albany, New York, the key mechanisms are downward travel of colder air, increasing mid-level lapse rates, and enhancing ice fog or low stratus risk overnight. While today remains mostly VFR, the cooling aloft and surface may lead to stratification, early morning fog, and possible wind shift shear near frontal boundaries. Flight crews in this corridor should monitor inbound fronts and alignment of wind and temperature profiles, especially in the overnight early morning time frame. Western U.S. plains and mountain/Pacific regions. While much of the western U.S. is outside the immediate scripts of the southern ridge and eastern trough, the macro-scale pattern shows zonal to weakly Pacific flow across the mountains, with few strong dynamic features. As a result, for operations in the Rockies and Intermountain West, today is largely benign. Light winds aloft, minimal precipitation risk, VFR conditions prevailing. But carry an eye for mountain wave activity if lower strata winds intensify or cross through ridges. Across the Pacific Northwest and California, marine onshore flow continues, and coastal terminals should monitor marine stratification and sea fog, though no major systems dominate today. Summary and outlook for aviation. In short, the U.S. weather pattern today is dominated by a stable ridge entrenched off the southeast coast, weak forcing in the Gulf, and the western trough late-week frontal system still a few days away. For aviation, expect largely VFR conditions in Florida and the southeast today, with elevated marine wind concerns along coasts. In the northeast, cooling aloft presents a risk of nocturnal stratification and fog or low ceilings. Flight planning should emphasize coastal takeoffs and landings, East Coast Florida, for potential low-level wind shear, surging onshore flow, and rip current-related sea spray/marine turbulence. Also monitor late-week frontal progressions if you operate cross-country. Overall, a quiet day from a convective standpoint, but stay vigilant for transition zone hazards.